Excellencies, Mr. Moderator, ambassadors, dear guests and colleagues, I'm very happy to welcome you to our Institute of International Relations and Political Science of Greenwich University, and to start this discussion, which is devoted to 50th anniversary of the Treaty of Elysée. I think in Lithuania not many people heard of this treaty. So I will pass the word to Mr. Krivas, and then it will be in safe hands of Petras to moderate this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Director, distinguished Deputy Speaker of the Parliament, Your Excellencies, Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. It is my very special honor this morning to welcome, on behalf of the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the organizers, participants, and guests of this roundtable discussion. Very special thanks to our Institute of International Relations and Political Sciences, and happy 50th anniversary of the Elysée Treaty to our French and German friends who are today also our close, important partners within the European Union and allies within NATO. The 1963 Elysée Treaty was, beyond any doubt, a landmark treaty between two great European nations. At the same time, it was a political and diplomatic masterpiece of two great European leaders, democratically elected leaders, legendary politicians, united by close friendship, mutual trust, as well as shared vision and values, President de Gaulle and Federal Chancellor Adenauer. The Elysée Treaty was the climactic chapter in the success story of a historic reconciliation, which remains even today one of the most spectacular in the world, even now, after 50 years. But it also has a broader meaning. It indicates and proves that all, even the most complex problems and conflicts can be resolved successfully to everyone's benefit if there is enough political goodwill from the parties concerned and there is an appropriate process in place. The Elysée Treaty did not appear out of nowhere. It was preceded by the liberation of Europe from Nazism, by the reconstruction under the Marshall Plan, by almost 2 decades of Cold War, by a few years of successful functioning of the European Community of Coal and Steel, by the 1957 Treaty of Rome, and it was closely followed by the 1967 Treaty of Brussels. All of this attests to the fact that it was not an event in itself, but rather an important part of an important process and a logical link in a chain. One could claim that the Elysée Treaty grew out of European integration and in turn served as a further catalyst of such European integration. Not only did the treaty mark the end of centuries-long historic rivalry, but it also turned the two countries concerned into a genuine vehicle of European integration, which, importantly, was open for others to join and contributed greatly, and in many respects, I would even say decisively, towards the shaping of the European Union we know today. The one this country joined in 2004 along with 9 others, and in which we will be proud to take over the presidency in the second half of this year. Why was that achievement, I mean the Elysée Treaty, at all possible? I think the primary reason is that both nations had in place sustainable, free market-based economies, stable democratic political systems, and free and open societies. In today's terms, we could say they were genuinely committed to the same set of values. For that reason, both their elites and societies recognize that the benefits of unity, cooperation, and integration outweigh by far whatever can be gained by mutual rivalry. The treaty marked the end of one great divide and sealed unity between France and West Germany. But it couldn't address other divides of that time. For example, East and West Germany remained divided for another 27 years. Yet the Elysée Treaty was good news not only to the two countries concerned and not only to the European communities at the time, but it was also good news for those who already in those days were dreaming of a Europe united in peace, democracy, freedom and prosperity, including the people behind the Iron Curtain in countries controlled by the Soviet Empire. As such symbol of hope for liberty, unity and prosperity, the Elysée Treaty has preserved its universal significance even today, and that is why it is, in my view, relevant and appropriate to celebrate, discuss and analyze it here in Lithuania, the incoming presidency of the Council of the European Union, as it is in Paris or Berlin or any other place in Europe. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, two broad societies' historic events represent as much interest as they mean something not only in the past, but also for the present and the future. After 50 years, the Elysée Treaty continues to be a source of hope and inspiration for those politicians, diplomats, civil society activists who look for solutions to complex problems of the world of today and tomorrow. On this note, in conclusion, please allow me to wish you a very instructive and intellectually challenging and satisfying event, and I would like to express my utmost regret that my schedule will not allow me to stay here throughout the event. Thank you very much.
Morning to everybody. Excuse me. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen. Indeed, Ramunas, thank you very much for inviting all of us for today's discussion and roundtable dispute on the Elysée Treaty, which is known again as a friendship treaty between France and Germany. I had no chance to say no to Ramunas once he made this proposal to me, once I realized that the treaty was ratified on the 16th of May 1963, which is a special day for me as well. So I simply took it very seriously and said to me, I have to be here and just to look probably 50 years from today to past in that situation which we had, I mean, those two countries had at that time. Indeed, Ambassador, we had a commemorative concert as well as a reception on in January, to my knowledge, which was a very cold day. And as far as I know, I mean, the January 22nd, 1963 was a cold day in Paris and even a grey day in Paris. So, but we couldn't compare the temperatures we had in January this year and then you had in 63. But anyway, the item is as good as it is. And indeed, we have privilege to have two speakers today. Both of them are the best ones, I mean, to explain to us the substance and probably the surroundings and all the conditions around that treaty, how it came, and how it's seen now, because I believe we don't see this treaty as over. I mean, the spirit of the treaty is alive, and as I read in many papers on, for example, on the celebration of the treaty from 2003, and I saw, I mean, new initiatives emerging and something, new actions which push this treaty and the spirit of friendship between France and Germany forward to future. And indeed, with no much to be said from my side, it is my great pleasure to introduce Madame Marion Gaillard, who is a Doctor of History, graduate from Paris Institute of Political Studies. Now, since 2002, she is a docent in the Paris Institute of Political Studies. And she is an expert in French-German relations as well as on European policies. Pleasure of mine to give the floor to you, Madam, and to use your presentation as the role of the French-German cooperation in the construction of Europe. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello to everybody. I'm trying to do my best in English. I'm very, very pleased to be here to talk about this treaty and the French-German friendship, which I think is very important for Europe today. You already said a lot about what I wanted to talk about, because I think it's first interesting to ask us why we are celebrating here in Lithuania the 50th anniversary of this treaty. What does it mean for the Lithuanian people, this treaty? You say that it's not so well known here in Lithuania, so we have to ask us why this can be interesting, I will. And why? Because the relationship between France and Germany was very important in the history of the European construction and remains very important today, as we'll see later with my German colleague. And that's what I want to discuss with you today. This is a special role of the French-German relationship in the construction of a united Europe. Why is the French-German cooperation so important? Because, as you know, and as it was said, before being friends, we made war to each other 3 times in less than a century, and so we used to hate each other before being friends. So we have to see how we get from such a hate to such a friendship today, and we made a long way to do that, and we made this way in the frame of the European construction. And the relation between us was the key of the unification of Europe, because the reconciliation between France and Germany was the essence of the European construction. It was the reason why we made Europe. We made Europe to pacify the relations between what we used to call the hereditary enemies. And the reconciliation was also the condition. It was the reason why we made Europe, but it was also the condition to make Europe, because we couldn't have made Europe without this reconciliation between us. So the relation between our two countries was the basis of the beginning of the process of European integration. And the first step of this reconciliation was not the Elysée Treaty, but it was the Schuman Plan in May 1950. What was the Schuman Plan? It was the proposal of France to Germany to put together the French and German coal and steel productions. So we can ask us, why does France, just 5 years after the end of the Second World War, propose such a revolutionary project to Germany? For many reasons, and first of all, not because we are kind and we want to make just peace with Germany, but because of American pressure on the French government. The United States of America wanted, in the context of the Cold War, to change the strategy they chose in 1945, which was to reduce the industrial potential of Germany. And with the Soviet threat, they want to stop this policy and to let Germany increase its industrial potential. And they want France to accept and to follow this new policy, but France doesn't want that at all. France was afraid of the reconstruction of a powerful German industry. So the French government proposed to create the European Coal and Steel Community to control the industrial German potential in a European war. And so we can see the French distrust toward Germany is one of the reasons why France proposed this plan. So this was not friendship, it was fear and distrust. I'm sorry to be pessimistic. Europe was clearly a way for France to settle the German question after the Second World War. The other reasons were first the fact that France needed an access to the German coal to assure the reconstruction of its economy after the war, and second, the necessity to stop humiliating Germany in order to avoid, to recreate the conditions leading to war. We had to stop that policy, and we had to avoid to do the same mistakes we did in the 20s. So Schuman and Monnet wanted to create the condition of a durable peace in Europe by pulling together the two industries of war. They didn't propose to pull together the cars production or the textile production. They choose coal and steel because coal and steel are the basis of the arms industry. So that was the first step of the European construction, and you know that the day of the Schuman Plan, the 9th May, is now the Day of Europe, so it is really the first step of the European construction. And the second step was made just a few months after the Schuman Plan, in October 50, and it was the Pleven Plan, which proposed to create an European army, including German soldiers. Once again, we can ask us why France, just 5 years after the war, proposed an army with Germany. For the same reason, that is to say, the American pressure on French government. With the beginning of the Korean War in June 50, the American government wanted to rearm Germany to strengthen the West's military capacity. And France, of course, doesn't want to see again an independent German army that can represent a threat for France. So the French government and Jean Monnet invented this solution. They tried to find an European solution to the German problem. We should create a European community of defense which would include German soldiers, but which would avoid the recreation of an independent German army. So it's once again a way for France to control Germany in the frame of an European community. A treaty was signed in 1952 in Paris, but the French Parliament refused to ratify this treaty in August 1954. The French deputies refused to vote that, and there were no European community of defense, and there is no community of defense today. So this project of the European Community of Defense was a project to avoid to rearm Germany by itself, but it failed because of the fear of France towards Germany. So we can see with these two steps, these two episodes, that in the beginning of the 50s, France and Germany are trying to work together, and the first step for reconciliation was made with the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, but fear is still present in France, and we can't really talk about a couple at this time, because in France we always talk about the French-German couple, and we can't talk in the early 50s of a couple. The couple will be born in the next step, which is the way to the Rome Treaty. After the failure of the European Community of Defense, the revitalization of the European construction process was not made by France and Germany, but by the Benelux countries, who proposed the creation of a common market. But the negotiation that began in 1956 were slowed down by mutual distrust between France and Germany. Because France was worried about the project of reunification in Germany, and Germany thought that France wants to use the European construction to establish its domination over the continent, which was not totally wrong. And there is this climate of mistrust, and we disagreed on many technical points of the treaty, especially concerning the common agricultural policy, and concerning free trade too. But two international crises, the Budapest crisis and the Suez crisis in November 1956, promote the French-German ties. Because these two crises showed us clearly that in the context of the Cold War, Europe is totally dominated by the two superpowers, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. So we have to build Europe. We have to unify the different countries of Europe to be able to survive in this new geostrategic context. Each European country is too small to resist to the influence of the two great powers in the world. And as they meet in Paris on the 6th November 1956, Konrad Adenauer, the German Chancellor, said to the French Prime Minister Guy Mollet, "Europe will be our revenge." So we have to build Europe to exist between the two superpowers. And at this time, the couple is really born. And this is a couple to make Europe move forward. And this couple was materialized by the signature of the Elysée Treaty a few years later. This treaty is a treaty of bilateral cooperation in culture, education, diplomacy, defense. It also creates a French-German office for youth in order to facilitate the interaction among young people between the two countries. And this treaty was the basis for a unique cooperation that doesn't exist between any other countries in the world today. And we have to say that because we used to hate each other, and now we have a most special relationship. And this cooperation became a real driving force for Europe, for the European construction, but not immediately. I mean, Konrad Adenauer and de Gaulle, and de Gaulle were not a very productive couple for Europe, for the European integration. They didn't really make Europe move forward, but with the Elysée Treaty, they left Europe a very precious legacy. And the couple reaches its full potential in the second part of the 70s with Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt from 74 to 81. We can talk later maybe in the discussion about the tandem made by Georges Pompidou and Willy Brandt. But for the moment I will concentrate myself on the two great couples, Giscard Schmidt and Mitterrand-Kohl. So, Giscard Schmidt knew each other for a long time, and they have a very good personal relationship. They were both members of the Committee for the United States of Europe created by Jean Monnet, and they both are convinced Europeans. And they are the fathers of the European monetary system born in 1979. Giscard wanted a monetary cooperation in Europe to take advantage of the strength of the Deutschmark. And Schmidt, even if he liked Giscard, was quite reluctant because he thought that the economic policy of France was too weak, because he thought that there was too much inflation in France. So he didn't want this cooperation, but the political change in France in 1976, with the arrival of a new Prime Minister, Raymond Barre, who made another economic policy focus on austerity and fight against inflation, was, made Schmidt change his mind, and Schmidt accepted to build the European monetary system. And they both proposed to their partners to make this new step for the European integration, and this was a very important step because it's the first step of the monetary unification of Europe that leads us today to the euro. The second and maybe most well-known French-German couple is the couple made by François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl from 82 to 95. They both had a really good personal relationship because, yes, thank you. Mitterrand and Kohl had a very good personal relationship because they shared the same vision that Europe is absolutely necessary for peace. Mitterrand was born during the First World War, and he was a soldier during the Second one. And Kohl was too young to be a soldier in the Second World War, but his brother died in this war, and his uncle died in the First World War. So they both are convinced that Europe is peace. So we have to make Europe. And they are both concerned also by the fact that building Europe is the only way for our continent to stay influent in the world. So they made a lot together for the European integration, and first they had to liberate the community of the problem of the British contribution. And today is the funeral of Margaret Thatcher, so we have a special thought for her. And Europe was at this time caught in this British problem, and to make Europe move forward, they first had to find a solution to this problem, and they made a secret Franco-German plan to make the European community work without Britain. How can we make a European community with 9 member states and without Britain? And this secret plan was not so secret, and they let the Foreign Office in London know that they are working on this plan, so that Margaret Thatcher had to accept their conditions, and that led to the solution of the British check. That is to say, we give back 66% of the British contribution, but she had to accept the revitalization of the European construction process that led to the signature of the Single Act in '86. And the Single Act is a very important treaty because it created the single market in which we live, you and me, today in Europe. That is to say, a single market without borders. I used to know the borders in Europe when I was driving and I had to stop at the border and to show my passport. This is over, and this is over because of the Single Act, which represents a very important step in the integration of Europe. Mitterrand and Kohl worked also together for the adoption of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, and they made a lot for the monetary unification, and they are the father of the euro, with Jacques Delors, who was at this time the president of the European Commission. And they also wrote a common letter in April 19 to their partners to propose a reflection about, to think about the political union, and that led to the creation in the Maastricht Treaty of the European citizenship, of the European foreign and security policy, and of the cooperation of the police and the justice in the European Union. So, France and Germany made a lot for Europe and for the Europe of today in which we are living. Why can France and Germany represent a driving force for Europe? Not because we are the same, but because we are different. We have very different approaches on quite every European problem. And because we are used to talk together, to negotiate, to make compromises, thanks to the Elysée Treaty, we can be this driving force. Because we are starting from very opposite positions, the compromises we found together often represent a sort of point of equilibrium that can be a good basis for the negotiation in the whole European Union. So we are different, and it's good like that. But this driving force has broken down for 20 years. It doesn't work so well since 1994. And for many reasons, but most because of the French reluctance on the institutional reforms of the European Union. Germany made many political proposals since 1994 with the Schäuble-Lammers paper, for instance, or the speech of Joschka Fischer in 2000. And all these proposals were going in the same way, that is to say, they proposed a federalism for Europe. But France doesn't want a federal Europe. France is not ready to give up its sovereignty to build the United States of Europe. And we can see that today, still, with Merkel and Hollande, because Merkel is calling for a political union, while Hollande first insists on a monetary and financial solidarity. So, is the French-German tandem still a leading force today in an enlarged Europe? Is it still relevant? It was clearly in the past. And that's what we are going to discuss now with my German colleague. Is it still relevant today? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam, for your presentation and your thoughts. Indeed, we follow closely the couple, as you said, French-German or German-French couple. Since then, and this couple is given even a common name. Same chancellor in Germany, I mean, two different presidents in France, and the title or the name is changed a bit from one to another, but we see this couple going along and looking to the future. Indeed, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward for further debate and more contributions in our Q&A session. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stefan Siedendorf from Germany. And Dr. Siedendorf he studied history and French studies in a double diploma program in two universities in Germany and France. Then he gained a scholarship for a master's program at College of Europe in Bruges, and again graduated with the European Political and Administrative Studies. Indeed, for the time of being, Dr. Siedendorf is a head of the European Politics Unit at the Franco-German Institute, Deutsch-Französischen Institute, and his current interests lie in the transformation of the societies within the process of regional integration that takes place in Europe, and he specialized in European studies and Franco-German relations, and even has developed a model to explain the institutionalization of this relationship. Dr. Siedendorf, we are looking forward to your remarks, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this invitation, Excellencies, Madame Ambassadrice. Thank you for providing this wonderful opportunity to come together and speak about this Franco-German treaty that is some time ago. And if you closely listen to this wonderful talk of my French colleague, then it may appear to you that all this comes from a long time ago, from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. So I was asked to develop a little bit on what does this mean today. Is it just like two grandparents who keep speaking about the war to the small child who are wondering why are they still speaking about these old stories, and okay, you're polite and listening to it, but anyway, this is not so important anymore? Or does this have a relevance today? It's not so easy to find out about this relevance today in a systematic manner, because there's a lot of normative talk. We like to give ourselves this very high symbolic elements of friendship, couples, reconciliation, which is difficult actually to explain what this means in concrete, very rational terms when we speak of two countries who have or forced to work together. If you have a look at my script, you see that this is very strange how to put this up actually. I tried to do three points, and I will start out with the historical legacy. So what Marion already told us, where is this coming from? We can ask ourselves today, what does this mean today? Is it still important today? Okay, we keep the symbol of reconciliation. This was the beginning of the European integration process. Without this reconciliation, we wouldn't have gone anywhere. But then, why did we have this need to reconcile? Because, of course, there were differences. And up to nowadays, Marion has said, there is still a lot of differences between France and Germany on many topics. So if you want, there's a high potential for conflict of interests, ongoing conflicts of interest between France and Germany on a lot of topics. For a long time during this European integration history, the Franco-German cleavage, the Franco-German conflict was the main cleavage line throughout Europe. On any given topic we didn't agree on each other in Europe, France and Germany were at the opposite ends. But this meant if France and Germany could find a compromise, then the others could follow. Nowadays, and this we can perhaps take up for the discussion, it's a little bit more difficult because this Franco-German cleavage line is no longer all the time the major cleavage line. It's still an important one, but we have others, East-West, for example, New-Old, more industrialized or post-industrial, North-South, agrarian. So we have all these different cleavage lines that take on this Franco-German cleavage lines. But still, what we can keep in mind from this historical legacy, this whole thing was about Franco-German differences and conflicts and the way how to deal with these conflicts. Meaning that we are no longer going to war, as we did before when we couldn't deal with our conflicts, but that we find a way how to build compromises. I found one nice quote this morning, which actually says a lot about this European integration process. It says, the closer you get to each other, the more you become aware of the differences. But our differences are the precious thing in Europe. So Europe is not about building a central state or something, and of building one single polity. It's of keeping and allowing for these differences, and all the elements that we centralized so far, we centralized in a democratic manner. It's nobody who imposed it, but it was all the member states who agreed. It was the European Parliament who agreed, so this is a democratic process. But still, we have to admit our differences. This is the one thing I would keep from my first point, that there's ongoing difference between France and Germany on a lot of topics. France and Germany are so different. The administration, the political form of the state, the ways even people think, people hold their most fundamental values. There's a lot of ongoing difference. But this is the interesting thing of it. If you're living in a Franco-German relationship, as I'm doing it, you have this permanent tension, even on a private basis. But this is also the funny and interesting thing about it. So it goes down from the very political level to the very personal level. This is why we are speaking of couples, by the way, also. Now, a second point would be, how are we going about to find compromises on these permanent conflicts? In the past, we were not very good in finding compromises. We were going to war when we couldn't find a compromise. Nowadays, we have an element of institutionalized conflict resolution. So I'm going to speak to you about the institutions of this Franco-German engine, and this is something not very prominent. You seldom find this in the in speeches or discourses that you hear, this highly symbolic moments. Nobody speaks about the institutions that keep working the administration, but this is where the work is done, actually. And you said, Mr. Chair, that the spirit of the treaty is alive, but even the treaty itself is alive. What did the treaty do in 1963? I would invite you to have a look at it, actually. It exists also in an English version, at least for the students amongst you, because it's very impressive. There's not much in it. Already at the time, they couldn't agree on much. They had the pressure, Adenauer and de Gaulle had the pressure of their parliaments, of their opposition. They couldn't agree on that much. This treaty has not one big element in it that would create Franco-German citizenship or something like this. It just says you have to meet at regular moments. You have to meet every 6 months as heads of state and government, every 3 months as ministers of foreign affairs, of defense, and of education, every 2 months for the ministers of youth and for the chiefs of staff, and every month for the head of the administration in the foreign offices. So every 4 weeks, your colleagues are basically meeting even more often nowadays on behalf of this treaty. And since 1963, no single one of these meetings has been cancelled. Nobody could get out of this institutionalized past dependency, which keeps running and which obliges even those politicians that are at the beginning skeptical on the value, the ongoing value of this Franco-German cooperation, forces them to accept and to honor these meetings. Now, of course, there are a lot of these meetings in the past that took place without that the heads of state and government, the chancellor and the president had much to say to each other. Positions were too far away, or they were new in their relationship, didn't know how to behave, or they were frankly not liking very much each other. But then, very soon after the beginning of this treaty in 1963, actually starting with the second couple, once that Adenauer and de Gaulle had to resign, you had regular press meetings at the end of these regular summits. So when the chancellor and the president come out, there is media, there is public opinion, putting pressure. What have you achieved? Is there a Franco-German conflict? Did you get along? Have you managed to bring ahead Franco-German friendship? And this is the second driving force behind this institutionalized way to cooperate. There is a Franco-German civil society, which is not very large. It doesn't take huge parts of the two societies, but it's highly institutionalized. You have a very good chance, if you're a French or German school children, that you will be taken to an exchange to the other country. You have a high possibility to go into one of these Franco-German double diploma programs, as I did one. This is why I put it on my CV, to show you that you can speak of products of this Franco-German cooperation, as I am one, as having done this Franco-German double diploma programs. And of course, this is the moment where you're socialized, where these young people learn what are their values, what are their ways of seeing the world, and what do they want to do in their life. And so it's this organized civil society that continues to put pressure via media, via public opinion on the politicians who have to meet regularly during these institutionalized meetings. So it's not only the spirit of this treaty that is alive, but it's also the very engine of cooperation that is alive. It permanently instaurates a permanent process of coordination and consultation, and very often the outcome, the conflicts persist, but then you have to meet 4 weeks again, 2 weeks again, 3 months again, and the same conflict comes up, and one moment you may find a solution that brings you further. I would, at the end of this second part, call this horizontal Europeanization. So you may have heard about the concept of Europeanization, which is mostly seen in a vertical manner, meaning that we decide something on the European level and then we have to apply this on the level of our member states, and there is change or transformation on the level of member states, called Europeanization. We adapt in a way to this European Union ways of doing things. Especially far-reaching in the new member states. We continue to call new member states after 10 years now already, where you have to do this transformation and change in a very fast and quick manner. But this brings also along a question of legitimacy. Is this really justified to adapt to these decisions, even if they are taken on in a democratic way on the European level? Is it really justified when we have to defend our sovereignty, the French would say, on the national level? If you regard on a formal level, then you could say, well, all these decisions come based on the institutions, on the decision-making tools that we have agreed upon together. There's nothing imposed. There's no European directorate or something that imposes something. But then there's also something like a social legitimacy, that the societies have to accept and have to go along and have to feel that these decisions are taken in a democratic, acceptable manner. And this is something that we could achieve over the horizontal Europeanization, meaning that we have to prepare the decisions amongst our governments and that we have to ground them in a cooperation of the two societies. And this can also be enhanced by institutions, as in the Franco-German case, and of course you could do this also in other constellations. Germany, for example, after the Eastern enlargement or after the fall of the Iron Curtain, tried to do this with Poland, with the Czech Republic. But if you have a closer look, we created a German-Polish youth office, as we did the Franco-German youth office. But it never went as far as in the Franco-German case, which has to do with the political will, that was lacking on both sides, and which has to do with this geopolitical constellation, American pressure that was no longer that strong as in the after-war time. Now, my third and last point would be, what are the consequences of these ongoing differences, my first part, of the Franco-German relation, and the institutionalized conflict resolution, second part. What are the consequences for today's European Union? Well, there are still situations where this Franco-German conflict, Franco-German cleavage, expresses a major European cleavage line, meaning that we are the incarnation of a European conflict. There are some other elements and some other situations where France and Germany are on the same side as older one, rather large one, post-industrial member states who want to impose something on the others. And these are moments where the Franco-German couple doesn't work in a very good sense. So we could say this Franco-German leadership actually can work to the better and to the worse. The question is if you want to start with the worse or with the better. I prefer to start with the worse and end with the better. So a case where this Franco-German leadership may be contested, where the others are not really fond of this Franco-German leadership, is a case where France and Germany on a major European conflict are more or less on the same side, perhaps not with the same position, but on the same side, where they have a political will, a common political will for leadership, and of course with their institutionalized way of cooperation, they may find a common position that they then can impose on the others, propose to the others, but they are structurally so large, with such a big share on economics, such a big share on population, a smaller share on votes. If you have a look at this, they are not having an equal vote share compared to their economic or demographic power, but still they can enforce this compromise. Very often these are intergovernmental compromises, meaning we're doing something like you were used to in the interwar period or on the international level, that we negotiate together as an international organization with each government having one representative around the table, and they are discussing and trying to find solutions, and you can exert structural pressure, perhaps slow pressure. The diplomats know how to do this in a very polite way, and at the end it comes out what you want. So this is a case actually where it may be hard within this European constellation for the others to accept this compromise, and may not even be a very good compromise for Europe. It may be a good one for the German Chancellor and the French President, not even in the long run, but shortly, because it may help them at the domestic front towards their parliaments and their public opinions, but it can be very short-sighted. So this is not a leadership in the long run. Now I come to the case where this works in a perhaps better way, the good Franco-German leadership, if you want. So, again, starting from a major European cleavage line, a conflict in Europe, France and Germany are occupying the opposite ends of this cleavage. So we are not agreeing on anything. We are very different on this cleavage line. But we have a political will to compromise. This is still very important. We have the political will and we have the tools to find this common position, which is a difficult matter, or which is quite difficult if you take into account that France and Germany are on the most opposite ends. You have all the other Europeans within these positions. Think of a left-right cleavage. Take, I don't know if this is dangerous, but I will speak about the current situation, austerity and growth. You may have on your right austerity, on the left growth. This is again a situation where Germany and France occupy two very different positions currently. They even are, in a way, the incarnation during the European Union, throughout the European Union, of this cleavage. All the others are somewhere on this continuum between austerity and growth. But if France and Germany manage to find a compromise, then this might be interesting for all the others. There may still be some smaller member states that could be brought into the compromise by a side payment. But this will be possible, thinking of that France and Germany are still very rich member states. It may help in such a case because this is a difficult compromise to find. And of course you don't see this if you look at the birthday celebrations. It's something that takes place behind the scenes. And there's very difficult negotiations going on. So it still may be that there's a lack of Franco-German trust. And this could be a moment where you bring in supranational European institutions to guarantee that compromise. That you say, well, actually, okay, the French have accepted this position, but who can trust the French? And on the other side, of course, the French will say, okay, now the German gave signs, but there were two translations to English and from English to French, as we no longer speak our mutual language, and it could be that they would say something different than what we understood. So how can we be sure that the Germans really do what they say? And at that moment you bring in a third player, European institutions, or even a supranational mode of decision making, saying that you put it to the European institutions. And now this could be a compromise that is very interesting for all of the other Europeans. They may find themselves within this Franco-German compromise, and they have a guarantee that they are not going to be dominated by the Franco-German couple, but that there are European institutions and European ways of deciding together, which in a way guarantee your fair share, your possibility to take part in the decision-making process. So this is for the good part of the Franco-German leadership. And now very shortly perhaps to give a truly political outlook, which I can do as I'm not representing any official body but a private institute. The current couple that seems to, current couple of President François Hollande and Chancellor Angela Merkel, who seems to undergo still this very first moment where they have to get into touch each other, get to learn how the other works. But if you have a look at them, the first element is this 50th anniversary forced them very quickly to work together, to accept and to reconfirm that this whole institutional machinery goes on and is still valid and is still to be used. President Hollande became elected in May, I think, 6 May. In September he came to our institute in Ludwigsburg and celebrated with Angela Merkel the speech of General de Gaulle to the German youth just before signing the treaty, re-signing the treaty 2013, remembering 1963, the signing of the treaty between Adenauer and de Gaulle. So immediately after the summer break, because there's still the month of August that has to be respected because it's holiday, but then immediately in September, they met and reconfirmed that this whole machinery is still running, that it's still worthwhile working within these institutional elements, and that they are willing to go further. A second point is they represent, obviously, different political ends. One is a social democratic, he wants to be called a socialist president. The other one is a conservative, she wants to be called Christian Democrat chancellor. Still, these are opposite ends. They're not agreeing immediately on all political points. So this is the situation again where we have a major political cleavage. But when out of this situation they can agree on a compromise, then this has chances to become a powerful compromise for Europe. What is perhaps still lacking a little bit at the moment is this political will to do the things together and take them first. For the moment, they serve each other from the machinery. They come up with common elements. The administration works together, but they are not yet on this point that they develop together a strong vision where they want to go. If they manage to pass that step, then they will have the political will, the institutions, this cleavage situation coming from different boards, and this may be a powerful vision for taking Europe further out of this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Siedendorf, for your presentation. And once our French and German couple made your statements on two perspectives and joint future, I call on Professor Ramunas Lipiškauskas to make his contribution, which has a title, German-French Tandem from the point of view of other EU member states. Ramunas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My contribution is a comment in reaction to what we just heard, adding some aspects which I see as important from the perspective of Lithuania or Baltic states or Central Eastern European EU member states. It's indeed a bit strange to use category new member states 9 years after the enlargement, even more strange to hear post-communist label more than 20 years after the fall of communism, but I'm glad I haven't heard that today. It was very interesting to listen to your presentations, and I really appreciate your candidness. First of all, reacting to the post-war situation and why the treaty is still important today. Of course, geopolitics was important. There is no doubt about that. The role of United States, as you said, was important. The whole idea behind French-German cooperation in terms of functional linkages in particular areas was also very important, but I would like to stress one more aspect which I missed a little bit and which is very important today if we think about French-German couple as an example of reconciliation among countries which have controversial history or difficult history previously. And I think this is, at least my hypothesis would be that having established liberal democracies in both countries was also a crucial condition for that, because if there were no liberal democracies, I doubt that you would have such a development of bilateral peaceful cooperation. And in such a way, I think the functioning of French-German motor or cooperative model in Europe, broadly speaking, is important not just in itself, but also as an example. And it was mentioned that, for example, Germany practiced similar, not to such extent, but somewhat similar attempts with Poland, with other countries. I would also mention Russia today as a possible candidate for similar cooperation, but that's why I'm speaking about established liberal democratic order. I think that's an important condition which is somewhat lacking if we talk about Russia and its attitude towards some of its neighboring countries. And I think this we have to have in mind, because if we look into literature on European integration, there is this basic, very strong belief that if countries trade among themselves, they will have functional reasons to cooperate. And German-French example is probably the most often provided example. However, Baltic states trade with Russia quite a lot, but this does not translate into functional need for constructive cooperation, how to put it. It paradoxically, one might say, pushes Baltic countries towards more integration with European Union member states, rather than extending functional linkages with eastern neighbors with which they trade quite a lot. And I think political situation in our neighboring countries and political risk which is linked to economic relations is one of the reasons. Of course, there are different geopolitical circumstances now compared to the aftermath of the Second World War, but I think we have to see the establishment of liberal democratic orders as an important condition, and I would stress this. I appreciate your emphasis on managing differences among France and Germany, differences in terms of attitudes towards federalism and further integration, further supranationalism, where France is much more reluctant than Germany. There are also important differences in terms of economic policy, something which might be symbolized by Stability and Growth Pact. Germany focusing on stability, France, at least rhetorically, focusing on growth. There is a lot of rhetoric here in this opposition of stability and growth, or austerity and growth measures. So management of these differences is what is the essence of cooperation. But my comment and partly a question to you, if you could reflect on this a bit more, whether you think that currently these differences are larger than they used to be, for example, when monetary union was created. A lot of studies of how Maastricht Treaty was drafted and economic monetary union was created point to the convergence of macroeconomic beliefs in France, Germany and Great Britain. And they point to this convergence of macroeconomic beliefs, macroeconomic policy, prescriptions as an essential precondition for the agreement on how monetary union should be constructed and how the mandate of ECB should be drafted, especially emphasis on inflation management, low inflation. Now it seems this convergence of beliefs is absent, or divergences between positions are wider, especially as reflected by current French president and administration and current German chancellor and German government. So I'm interested if you think this might become a bigger obstacle to further process of managing what's happening in the Eurozone and moving towards what some people, a lot of academics call unfinished institutional architecture of economic and monetary union. yes, we see recently joint initiatives of France and Germany, for example, Pact for Competitiveness. This was, as far as I know, first drafted between France and Germany and their institutions, and then presented as a joint initiative to other member states. I'm not sure if this fits into your bad example category or good, since there were some criticisms from other member states expressed that it was done in such a way as presenting others with a fait accompli.
You understood the model. Very good.
It's still quite controversial, I think, here in Central Eastern European countries. Some of the proposals in the Pact, for example, harmonization of corporate tax base, which according to some people has little to do with competitiveness. In other countries, other proposals are quite controversial, pension reforms, increasing age of retirement. So I wonder what you think, how similar instances can look in the future, taking into account divergences of positions of these countries. And finally, my other point is on one more area, which is probably the most important area for Lithuania, for the Baltic states, and this is energy policy, which I would mention not only because it's a priority area for the Baltic states' European policies, but also because, at least my reading is, this is one of few areas where German-French motor is not working from the very start of the proposals of the European Commission for integrating energy policy among member states. I see energy policy as part of the single market, where single market principles are still not functioning. And here we can see an example of how difficult it might be to integrate for the EU member states when France and Germany are not leading. At least that's my understanding. We can talk about different reasons why this is the case. I think the main reason is different regulatory regimes in France and Germany compared to, for example, Britain, Nordic countries, other member states. Energy is a policy area which is very intensely regulated, where huge investments are required for changes. But this is the area where Baltic states see as one of the most important areas where integration is still not completed. And for us, we wish there was much more active French and German efforts, attempts to integrate. So I would also be very interested to hear your comments on this issue. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Romanos, indeed. An excellent kickoff for our discussion, and I understood that you asked both our experts to make certain reference towards the macroeconomic as well as energy mix, not to speak about the nuclear energy perspective of both countries, which we understand might be and is so far drafted as a bit different. And from my side, I wish I need to add to this discussion above all, what was the public reaction to the Elysée Treaty in both countries? Since sometimes we simplify the situation, even 20 years after the World War II. Some treaties were not signed between neighboring countries. If I am right, even the German-Dutch treaty was signed in 65 or 64, meaning that it took some time, to reconcile and to agree on some things which been seen in a different way for long periods of time. And since couple spends a lot of time in the kitchen, in the same kitchen, what language does the couple speak? I mean, Franco-German Ministerial Council. What language do you use? Once the ministers meet, do you speak French and German with the simultaneous interpretation, or do Do you speak English? Right, but the floor is yours, and then we'll begin from our French friend.
I think for the last question, it depends. Giscard and Schmidt, they talk English together, and Mitterrand and Kohl, they both talk their own language, so it depends, and in the administration it depends too, but I think English is more and more used, and that's what I wanted to say with the language, to react a little bit. We have today a diminution of the people who learn German in France and French in Germany, which I think is not a good thing, because of course it's very important to speak English, but to really know each other and to have an access to the culture of the other country, it's quite good to talk the language. And we see that really less and less students or pupils are learning German in France and French in Germany. My own daughter learned German because I wanted to, but my friends thought I'm totally stupid. They all say to me, she has to learn English. Why do you choose German? What a stupid idea. So we have problems to really show the importance of this language. And I think it's not a good evolution, because we see through recent polls that France is not so attractive anymore in Germany. I read a lot about that in the papers, and France used to be very attractive for the German, and it's not the fault today, and the fact today. And in France, Germany was never really sexy. When you said, I go on holiday in Italy, in Spain, wow, it's great. But when you say, I go on holiday in Germany, just Berlin today among young people is very attractive, but Germany not so much. So we have a lot to do. We are friends till 50 years, but we have still a lot to do to make the society like each other a little bit more, I think. You spoke about example for reconciliation, and I'm very sensitive to that. And we can use our model of reconciliation between France and Germany for Germany and Poland, for instance, or I think two of the Balkan regions, because Croatia will become the 28th member state in a few months, and we will have Slovenia and Croatia in the same European Union, and maybe one day Serbia and Bosnia. So the European Union, the European construction, is still a way to reconcile countries, as we made. So I think it's very important, and this is the relevance of the French-German cooperation. It is peace in the world. There is no hereditary enemies. It doesn't exist. It's just the political will to overcome this hate, which can be also maybe used between, that's more difficult, but we can even dream, for Israel and the Palestinians. There is no hereditary enemies, so we can imagine they can build a community of water, I don't know, just in the model of the coal and steel community. So I think it's really important what you said about that. Well, about the convergence of the macroeconomics analysis, that's true that there were a triumph of the liberal vision when we negotiated the Maastricht Treaty, and France was converted to this vision, even if it was led by a socialist president. But we have to remain that it was very, very difficult for France, even if we accepted the liberal vision. It was very difficult for us to accept the independence of the central bank, which was not in our tradition, and the conditions of Maastricht regarding not the inflation, but regarding the public deficit and the debt. That was totally opposite of our tradition in economic policy. So it was a real compromise for us. And I want to be optimistic. We are very different today, but we have to think about the fact that we were very different for 20 years too, and we overcome this difference. So we can hope that it will be the case for Merkel and Hollande, I hope, but it's difficult. I think it's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comments, very good. I will take together the question of the language regime and the reaction of the public opinion to the Elysée Treaty, because this allows me to make a point on Franco-German difference. I'm not as skeptical as you about this question of language regime. They were always contested and difficult. It was never the most favorite aim of German Jews going to France, and especially not of the French Jews going to Germany. In 1963, if you have a look at the public opinion, or the published opinion rather by then, it was very contested. It said there's nothing in this treaty. This is something two old men did together, and they don't have really the support of their parliaments. The German parliament put a preamble to it saying that this cannot do anything against the German-American cooperation and can do no harm to this relationship with the United States. And even the two, Adenauer and de Gaulle, I think they didn't expect the evolution that this treaty would take over time. They didn't know about, by then, the role of institutionalized cooperation, how this today acts upon the liberty, if you want, of these political leaders that they have to meet, even if they don't have to say anything to each other. So, by the time we find quite skeptical and skeptical reactions, you find a huge population of Charles de Gaulle when he comes to Germany 6 months before the signing of this treaty, where the crowds are hailing to him. But this is actually also due to the fact that the general, the man, the military, who fought Germany in 2 wars, comes to Germany and says to the young people, you are the children of a great nation. Yes, a great nation. This is amazing. This, of course, makes people think and engage into this idea of Franco-German friendship. But it's not something that you could link to the treaty. And so even nowadays, this question of language regime, there's of course transformation. We have to reinvent our couple in a way. But our policy, we are also operational when we do these exchanges. It's not a problem if they speak English to one to another. This can be a step to further get interested into the neighbor and then to learn the language. I'll give you an example. This is more an anecdotal example. This is more telling than if I do this on the abstract level. Myself, I was very bad in French at school, and this was something I most hated because we had a French teacher. So, and he was starting right off with Le Malade Imaginaire de Molière in the original language of the 16th century. It was very close to Latin, actually. I couldn't understand anything, and I was quite sure in my A-levels that it was impossible to speak this language any day. It was just something you could study like Latin when you could find the verb through the translation. And I wasn't very close to French people either. They were strange, so different from us. I get to learn to speak some French in Western Africa, actually, when I had the chance to take part in an exchange co-financed by the Franco-German Youth Office. So it was a Franco-German mission, but it took place far away in Western Africa, and there were only 2 French who came with us, a group of 10 Germans and 20 people from Burkina Faso. And there I felt that you can speak this language. I was obliged to speak it. I was allowed to do mistakes, because when speaking to French, I opened the mouth and said, well, this is wrong, it's not French, basically. And after this, I got interested in it and wanted to study it and get it somewhat deeper and understand in a better way this language, this culture. But it's not that it is something natural. It's created, it's in a way artificially created by these institutions, and this holds on up to nowadays. And the challenge now is to reinvent in a way this institutional regime to keep it attractive and to keep it running. And this is something I see especially on the French side. You will have to reform your educational system in a way that these young people learn and speak two modern foreign languages. English plus another one. This is the main challenge, especially more for the French than for the German side, which has also to do with the sociology of the French Lycée, where we have more people coming to the A-levels than in Germany. But so this is on the Franco-German query. To your other questions, the economic divergence is very interesting. They are there right from the beginning, actually. In the 1960s already, you have this very Colbertist France, with this idea under the Gaulle that we are doing, the state is an active player who actually organizes political growth and economic growth and economic reform. And it comes up all the time. It is underlying when Schmidt and Giscard negotiate, of course, during the Maastricht Treaty, and the pre-Maastricht Treaty, up to nowadays. This literature on agreement on the macroeconomic beliefs, I know what you're speaking about. I think we have to look who are the actors who agree, actually. And there are very few of them. The heads of the central bank, parts of the French government, not even all members of the government, but those who were decisive. The Commission President was a Frenchman, and the German Chancellor. And if you say, well, this agreement was sufficient to bring up that compromise, then you can say, well, this is still the case. If you have or you would ask perhaps the ambassador to give the official version of the French position nowadays, then she would probably say this is a wrong opposition amongst austerity and growth. We have to have a look at reforming our budget. I had the chance to speak with Jan Moscovici 2 weeks ago, and he said, well, we need a sound budget. We must cut down this high sovereign debt, and we have to act politically, actually, rid of this dependence of the financial market. And there's no way of not doing this. This is the official position of the French government. So even if behind this it comes down to a compromise between growth or being not so strict on this austerity and austerity, there is still a major belief in the French government, on this macroeconomic fundamentals. It's not that they are madgun Keynesian doing public deficit spending or something. They are still adhering to this fundamental compromise. It's more difficult if you have a look at public opinion and the discussions that are going on. There you really have, and this is again more on the French side, this big difficulty to admit that since the Single European Act, we constructed something, institutions, policies and all this, and that you can no longer discuss as if you are before the oil shock, basically, in the 1970s, where all this did not exist and where you could propose a Keynesian or a more austerity model. We have constructed all this together and it had its effects, and so today it's more difficult to do as if there was still this, like on a theological basis, nearly to say there are two big alternatives and we can do both of them. This is would be quite difficult today, but in the administration, in the government, they are, to my understanding, very much aware of this and not putting it into question, but still perhaps completing the German point of vision. And this is the Economic Growth and Stability Pact. It was a one-sided agreement under Sarkozy and Merkel. It was a stability pact, and we didn't take care of the growth side, which was a thing that was not, in a long time, to my understanding, wouldn't be able to work. This regime would have big difficulties, probably like the initial Maastricht criteria, which were a little bit in the same line, that you don't have real instruments of sanction if you're not adhering to it, that it's basically an intergovernmental regime, a regulatory regime, and that you're not doing the growth elements at the European level that you can no longer do on the national level. So the same elements we find in this Stability Pact, but you also see immediately when François Hollande announces, I want to add something to it, the growth section, Merkel says, this is no problem, we can do this. What they did currently is still very much the Stability Pact, there's not much growth in it so far. But this is an ongoing discussion. You see that immediately the Chancellor is advised probably by her councillors that there is this Franco-German machinery, and that even if she is not changing the elements that we agreed upon so far, this has never been done, something was agreed by this gap, she's open and well, let's see if we can get a growth element on it. So this is rather an argument to say the engine is running and they are working on it, but it's not. It will not be French deficit spending growth model. It will be a compromise out of both of them. And the last point, very quickly, energy policy, very interesting and very difficult. It's part of the single market, you're right. This is why it's difficult to take a Franco-German leadership that would take place outside this single market regime. It will have to take place within single market regime. We have the situation that we have two very different positions. The French one rather with nuclear energy, the German one rather with this energy transformation. And we now have a situation also where the French side is favorable of entering into renewable energy, but still keeping its nuclear part. It's not so much working on the traditional energies, perhaps what's interesting to you also, to the oil elements, gas elements, all this. There we have really two different regulatory regimes in both countries. It's very powerful private companies running the thing basically, and this is, to my understanding, what refrains the political actors of bringing this into the single market. So there we have a competition between two regimes, the European single market regimes and this Franco-German regime. And this is why I'm very skeptical that we will see major advances in this respect, even if there are some elements coming up on the Franco-German level that we, on our level, can feel or see. There are a lot of round tables now going on. There are working groups that are being installed, and perhaps something comes out of it. But they have a very Franco-German standard point of view. So it's much more renewable energy. How are you going with this in Germany? Solar energy, wind energy, and the Germans want to know how are you dealing with this nuclear question in France, because it didn't went that well in Germany, going out of the nuclear part. Those keep apart. They are huge traditional players, Total in France, in Germany, NBW, for example, or E.ON, keep on doing the big business.
With this in mind, I wish to thank you, our participants of this roundtable discussion, indeed. Thank you for coming, thank you for bringing your insights, explaining some aspects of the Elysée Treaty, of birth of this treaty. And I should say that the treaty as such, even after 50 years of history and cooperation, is still a key document for reconciliation in Europe.